Here we will see working of API gateway in microservice architecture. When an external client communicates with a microservices system, the gateway processes the request through 5 distinct operational phases. The client sends an HTTP request to the API gateway. When the API gateway receives this request, it authenticates and validates the request. Then it determines which microservice should handle the request, and the request is forwarded to the appropriate microservice. The microservice processes the request and returns a response, and the API gateway sends the response back to the client. First, request interception. In an API gateway microservice, request interception is achieved through filters or middlewares or dedicated features in reverse proxy libraries like YARP. That is yet another reverse proxy, or offload, which captures, inspects and modifies the HTTP request before routing them to the backend microservices. This process centralizes cross-cutting concerns such as security, traffic management and auditing, so that individual microservices do not have to implement them independently. The client sends this HTTP or HTTPS request to a single domain and port which is owned by the gateway, and depending on the client need, client can implement it in 2 primary ways. First, pre-routing interception, that is pre-filters, where code executes as soon as the HTTP request hits the gateway. This is where rate limits are checked and payload structural validation happens. And post-routing or pre-forward interception. Here it is executed after the gateway determines the downstream microservice destination, but right before forwarding the payload. Security headers, user context mutations or payload translations happen here. Then authentication and authorization. Authentication is like the gatekeeper which validates IDs at the entrance. When a client sends the request, the API gateway confirms the credentials and ensures it is a verified user. JSON web tokens are commonly used for authentication in microservices architectures. These tokens represent claims between 2 parties that can be securely transmitted as part of the request. The API gateway validates this token and ensures authenticity of the user and grant access accordingly. Once the API gateway confirms the visitor authenticity, it shifts to the authorization. The API gateway utilizes information from the JWT that checks if the authenticated user possesses the necessary permission to enter specific microservices. It guarantees everyone heads to their designated areas without disturbing on private spaces. This process maintains a secure and orderly flow within your microservices architecture, similar to a well-managed entry point. Then route matching. Route matching in an API gateway is the process of evaluating incoming client request attributes against predefined criteria to determine which backend microservices should process the traffic. It acts as a traffic controller of a microservice architecture. An API gateway evaluates every incoming request against a collection of routes. A route is usually considered as a match only when all specified criteria evaluates to true. By matching request at layer 7, that is application layer, the gateway abstracts the internal service topography from the client. Then request forwarding. Request forwarding in an API gateway is the process where a centralized entry point receives an incoming client request, intercepts it to perform cross-cutting tasks, and then securely routes to a specific downstream microservice which is capable of handling that request. This decouples external clients from internal service locations, which hides the structural complexity of the microservices network. And response translation in an API gateway. Response translation, often referred to as response transformation or protocol translation, which is the process where the gateway intercepts data from the backend microservices and modifies its format, structure or protocol before delivering it to the client. This layer decouples internal service implementation from the public API contract exposed to the consumers.